So I talked to someone who's been teaching students and the public about Marxism for years, Dr. Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
Even the Democratic Party suddenly confronted with a socialist who isn't marginalized simply because he gives himself the name socialist. In fact, it makes him attractive. What Bernie Sanders is proving is that the interest in socialism has captured millions of Americans.
So I think a lot of people are aware of socialism now, especially since we have a self-proclaimed democratic socialist running for president, but they don't actually understand what it means. I think they're taking little bits and pieces, free healthcare, free education. Talk about the means of production and how a socialist economy would actually be structured.
They came up with the following idea, that the problem of capitalism is two fundamental things. One, that private individuals own the means of production. They own the land, they own the factories, they own the stores, the machinery, and that the people, the owners, are really a very small part of the population. 1%, 2%, 5%, maybe even 10%, although rarely did it get that high. But that means the vast majority of people are never part of the owners. And the basic socialist idea was, if you allow a small number of people to control the means of producing all the goods and services we all need to survive, they're going to use that control to make the system work for them. And they're not going to worry about the rest of us. In other words, it's a recipe for a society that produces wealth for the top 5 to 10%, but not for everybody else, that gives power, political and other power, to those at the top and not to everybody else. So the socialist idea was, this is fundamentally unjust, fundamentally undemocratic, this is what's wrong with capitalism, and how do you solve it? You make collective ownership, not private. The society as a whole should own the means of production, the factories, the offices, the stores, so that they are good for everybody, so that what they produce is distributed roughly equally, so that the influence and the decisions are made. So social, that's why it's called socialism, it's the society that should own. It focuses on the workplace. Its idea is the way you make sure that the government never again becomes an institution over the people, but rather simply an instrument of the people, is by making sure that at the base of society, where people live and work, the wealth, the productive capability is in their hands. If you want the slogan of 21st century socialism, it's this: democratize the enterprise. End this process where there's a handful of people who make the decision. In most American corporations, and corporations do the bulk of the business in modern capitalism, a tiny group of what are called major shareholders, the people who have big blocks of shares, they select who the board of directors. 1% of Americans own 3/4 of the shares. It's highly concentrated. A tiny number of people, the 1%, own the bulk of the shares. How do you run a corporation? At the top is something called a board of directors, usually 15 to 20 people. How do you get on the board of directors? There's an election every year to get on that board. And the way the election works is, if you own a share of stock in the company, you get 1 vote. If you have 10 shares, you get 10 votes. If you own 1 million shares, you get 1 million votes. If you have no shares, that's how many votes you get. So there's no pretense of democracy. So if a handful of people own the bulk of the shares, they control everything. They select the 15 or 20 people on the board of directors. The board of directors decides what the company produces, how the company does it, where the company is located, and what's done with the profits. Everybody helps produce the profits. The employees have to live with the decision, but have no influence on it. It is the opposite of democracy. And if you don't have democracy at the workplace, you can't ever have it real in politics either, because those at the top will buy the political system, something which we see in the United States so starkly every day that everyone knows. If workers took over a factory that had a worker co-op instead of a top-down, and the workers together decided what to do with the profits, you think they'd give a few executives $25 million so they have more money than they know what to do with, while everybody else has to borrow money to send their kids to college? It'll never happen. You think a collection of workers, say 400 in a factory, considering that you could make more money if you moved the production to China, are they going to vote to get rid of their own jobs? It's not going to happen. They're not going to destroy their community by having an empty factory. They're not going to deprive their local government of the tax revenues to run the schools and the hospitals. And they're not going to deprive themselves of jobs. So what we've had in the last 40 years, all those jobs leaving, would never have left if it was the collective decision of the workers where this production is going to take place.
And I wanted you to also just counter another argument that I hear constantly. I earned it. You know, we earned this money.
The best way to describe this is to go back to Karl Marx and his analysis of capitalism so that we all understand what earning is about. Let's imagine you are a person looking for a job and I'm the employer that you're looking to get hired by. So you come in and you sit down, you fill out your application form, and I look at you and I describe to you the kind of work we'd like to have you do. You'll come 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and you'll sit over there and you'll do this kind of work, et cetera, et cetera. And we get through all that and you're okay with that. And then we get to that big question, how much are you going to get paid? And let's say we dicker back and forth and we agree on $20 an hour. So I'm going to pay you $20 an hour. At this point, Marx enters with a smile on his face and says, I'm now going to show you, the reader of his books, that when that deal is done, the $20 an hour, something is going on that you actually know, but you don't want to face, but I'm going to show it to you. When I hire you for $20 an hour, I know that for every hour that you give me your work, your brains, your muscles to work, I'm going to have more stuff to sell at the end of the day because you're added to my workforce. You're going to help me produce more goods or more services or better quality goods and services than I would have if I didn't employ you. So I'm going to say to myself, it costs me to get Abby $20 an hour. What do I get out of it? I'm going to have the output that Abby adds by her labor. Now that has got to be more than $20. So the only way I'm going to hire you for $20 an hour is if you produce more in the hour than I give you. So when you feel in a vague way at the end of the day as you walk home that you're being ripped off, you're absolutely right. Or in Marx's language, exploited. So what does the capitalist say? I earned it. No, you didn't. You just ripped people off. The way most corporations work is 4 times a year. They take the profits they've made in the preceding 3 months, and they distribute a portion of them to their shareholders. These distributions are called dividends. So if you own a lot of shares, say because you inherited them from your grandma, or you stole money and bought them on the stock market, there are lots of ways of getting them. But if you have them, 4 times a year, you go to your mailbox in the morning and you get an envelope and you tear it open, and inside is a check for your share of the profits that have been distributed to shareholders. For rich people, this is millions of dollars. They have all that money. What did they do exactly to earn that money? Nothing. Those people are going to tell me they earned? Earned what? Did they ever set foot in the factory? No. Do they have any idea what this company does? No, they don't care. They are simply sitting there collecting. Well, let's now do a little logic. If there are people like shareholders who get a lot of goods and services they didn't help produce, then there must be elsewhere in that system people who produce what they do not get. So that means, if we allow that we are saying, some people, your job is to produce a lot more than you get so that these people can get a lot more than they produce. For Marx, he stands up and says, I rest my case. This system sucks.
Famous socialist Rosa Luxemburg once said that it's either socialism or barbarism. Here we are 100 years later. In what ways have you seen that play out today?
The 62 richest people in the world, most of whom are Americans, not all Americans, but most of whom are U.S. citizens. The 62 richest people together have more wealth than the bottom half of the population of this planet, roughly 3.5 billion people. That's beyond obscene. I don't know what, I don't have an adjective that captures this, but I can describe what it means. If you look at all the statistics of the World Health Organizations, the bottom half of our population are people who die way earlier than they need to. Why? Because their diets are no good, or they don't have enough food in the first place, or they can't get to a clinic to have little problems that are easily solved by modern medical methods taken care of. It's unspeakable what happens to the lower half. If we took half the wealth of the richest, and they would still be the richest, and made it available to the bottom half, it would transform their lives, literally. Now, there's no moral or ethical justification for this situation. Number two, it is well known all over the world, despite a few deniers that are still around, that the way capitalism has evolved has compromised the ecology and environment of this planet, literally threatening us with 27 diseases and 57 losses of fundamental resources. This is crazy to permit this to go on. This is another way capitalism confronts us with barbarism. And the third one is, and here the United States plays a particular role, is this notion that the Western world, the world that has the wealth and the military might, is in a war, an endless war against something as vague as terrorism, whatever exactly that is, and that this is used to justify an endless use of resources not available for people's needs, but to combat one enemy, real or imagined, after another. So we literally confront an endless military warfare state, a cataclysmic destruction of our natural environment, and a level of inequality that has no justification. Our entire economic situation would have been completely different in the last 30 years if we had had a movement, if we had had organizations to make these demands, because I haven't the slightest doubt that the majority of Americans will support all of them. You know, it used to be at this point in an interview, I would have to look at a skeptical interviewer saying, Americans support this kind of socialistic stuff, but I don't have that problem anymore because Mr. Bernie Sanders has done me a favor by throwing his hat in the ring in the Democratic primary and running around the country as he's been doing. As a socialist, he has proven for all Americans to see that the support for something other than capitalism has now captured millions of Americans. And we don't know how many millions because that still has to be shown. And the argument that was heard when Occupy Wall Street emerged in 2011, that this is a tiny group of people who don't represent anything, all that's gone because Mr. Sanders has said, well, let's see. Let's see how many people are critical of the 1% versus 99. How many people will support a candidate who says that every day and who even accepts the label socialist? And the answer is millions.